Welcome to the 6th module of Using Vue with ASP.NET Core by Example. My name is Sean Wildermuth. This module, we're going to be digging into making a single-page application out of our Vue project. I'm going to start by introducing you to the Vue router. We'll be adding some routes. I'll show you how to use the router view, router links, route parameters, and then nested routes. Let's get started. So before we dig into the code, let's talk about the idea of SPA. Whenever I see that SPA acronym, I know it means single page application, though I'm not a big fan of the term. If you've ever seen me do a talk on SPAs before, you know that I prefer not to use the acronym of single page applications. The reason is it implies that you're going to have one page that handles an entire application. And while in some enterprise apps that may make sense of building these large monoliths, I often will say that building smaller single page applications where you might have a handful of them for different parts of your application in many ways can be the right thing to do. With that in mind, single-page applications are typically these monolithic and enterprisey sort of apps. There are SPAs that are consumer-facing, but they're less common. The idea behind a single-page application is they want to be able to replace web navigation and want to centralize services. The important idea here is that as the user goes through what we think of as a page, as a visual representation of some work they want to do, we want to be able to save that state in those services so that every time they post back to get a new page, in the way we think about it on the web, we're not having to reconstruct that every time. It allows us to build applications that are friendlier to users because users don't necessarily want to think about the way the web works just to get their job done. So one of the most common questions I get about SPAs is should we be using them everywhere? And I find that they're typically overused. Creating SPAs for forms over data or for reporting or dashboards is a really great idea. They represent ways to get at data, to fill in data, to create new data in very powerful ways. But many times people try to crowbar a SPA into what is typically a standard website, and that ends up being just silly. So now that I've preached to you a little bit, let's dig in and show you how to actually create a SPA with the Vue code we've been using in our examples. So let's introduce routing and create our first route. We're going to start over here on the Vue.js website, and inside the ecosystem, you'll see a section for Vue Router. This is a core library that has been written by the Vue team, specifically to allow us to look at the way routing works. And it has its own web page and its own set of documentation for getting started. The way we're going to get started is we're going to open up that package.json file again. And just like we added Vue and Axios, vvalidate, Vuex, we're going to go ahead and include Vue Router. So we're going to get started by first creating a new JavaScript file. So far up to this point, the index page.js has been the starting point for our application. We're going to step one further back from that because our existing page that we've already created is going to become the first route in our application. And when I talk about route, essentially I'm talking about breaking up each of the different pages that we can show a user into separate controls that can be displayed on the screen. From the user's perspective, it's just going to be the product list or the checkout page that's going to be shown, but from our perspective, those are just going to be components that are shown on the page. And let me show you what this looks like. I'm going to first create an app.js, so you can call it anything you want. And before I go ahead and build this, let's open up our Vue. And we're going to make some changes here, but the first thing we're going to do is actually just change the index to the app.js so that this is the starting point for our particular page. We also need routing in here, so let's go ahead and create a new script in here for Vue Router, Vue Router. Now that we've included Vue Router and pointing to our new JavaScript file, let's go over here and we're going to start by just saying router use and say Vue Router. Just like we did with vvalidate and Vuex, we're going to add the Vue Router as a plugin to Vue. Once we have this, we're going to need to do a couple of things, but let's first create an object called routes. And this is just going to be an array that contains individual objects that represent what we need for each type of route, each destination in our routing. And for our first route, we're going to give it a path. And this is going to be what we want to use as the pattern matching in the same way we would in ASP.NET MVC use routes for pattern matching. So I'm just going to say the root of our website, and then I'm going to tell it what component I want to actually point to for this route. And in this case, I'll create a a new component that I will call the product list. Notice I'm capitalizing it because I'm going to think of it as the constructor for a product list. This is just a convention, not something you have to necessarily follow. Now that we have the routes, then we can go ahead and create our new Vue object, just like we've done before. In this case, we'll want to say where it lives, and that's going to be that index page that we've been using. If you go over here to index view, you can see that it's index-page, and that's what we'll actually end up using here. That's, again, the selector for where this Vue instance wants to be responsible for. We're also going to include the store so that our data store can be used not only in this Vue instance, but it'll be passed down to every single component that needs it. And then finally, you're going to set a property called router by saying new Vue router, and then passing in an object with the array of routes. So at this point, all we're doing is that we're telling it that we want to use a router. These are the routes that we're defining, and then this is going to be responsible for the main page. Next, let's go ahead and build that product list that we need that represents the main page of our spa. We'll do that by changing the index.page.js into a new products list component. So now let's create that products list component out of our existing main view. We're starting with this idea of creating the product list because I want to show you that we will need to refactor some of the pages that we have. And so we're going to take not only that product list page that we've been using as our home page, but eventually we're going to also take that checkout page and make it a component as well. So we come here to our index.page.js. Let's rename that to product list, since that is what it really represents. And so let's open that file for a moment. We're going to start by changing this from a VM to just, let's call it our product list component. This is not going to be the new view. This is actually just going to be the raw object that contains all the information about our component. So it's the same structure, but we're going to need to change a few things. Like we're no longer going to have it point at an element to take over, and we no longer need to pass in the store because we'll get that from the parent view object. We also need to change the way that the data structure is. Inside of a component, this data needs to actually be a call function. And the reason for this is components end up being constructors of new objects. And so if we just had the data in this form, we would get the same data for every component. So we actually just need to change this to a function and then return what represents our data. And this way, when it gets constructed as a new component, we're going to get a new instance of the data. This is specific to the way component development is handled, and so make sure you include it there. Now that we've made those changes, we need to actually create the product list object that we had talked about using in the app.js. We can do that by calling Vue component, just like we've done otherwise, and just passing in that product list component. And so this is creating a named component. We could use it in other places as well, but let's go ahead and give it a name, and we'll just call it our product list. Just like we've created other components like the weight cursor and the cart, we're doing the same thing, but with our main page instead. If we go back to the index page, we'll need to include this new component. We can do that by just dragging it over, because we now need the product list inside our app.js. So we want to make sure include that before the app.js. But we also have this product list that is depending on this entire section of markup. Remember, it assumed that its template was everything inside of this index page. So we're actually going to cut this out for the moment, and we're going to create it as a template in the templates folder. So let's create a new file in templates called productlist.html, and then we'll just include all of that data exactly the way it was on the home page. We don't have to make any changes whatsoever, because when we assign this template to the product list, it's going to assume that all of the binding is going to be based on the component that owns this HTML. Because of that, we need to change this component to not just specifying the product list component here, but a function with a callback. We did this when we were creating remote templates before, and we'll copy that same pattern. So we're going to have a resolve and a reject. Let me move this up a little so you have some room to breathe. And then here we'll use Axios again to get templates, product list.html. And then again, just like we've done before, we'll do a then with a function that returns the result. And we'll also have a catch here that has a callback function. In this case, we'll just call reject so that if there's a failure, make sure that period is there, it'll go ahead and reject and throw an error. But if it succeeded, we can then just say product list component.template equals the result.data, just like we've done before, and then we can just resolve with the product list component. So same pattern we've done before, but again, we're converting this all into our product list. So we have this new product list. We're using it in the app to specify that the root page should look like the product list. What else is there to do? The last thing is we need to tell the app.js component here where to put our views, where to put the component that our routing is pointing to. Now, this is saying we're responsible for that index page that we see here in index.html, but we need to essentially put a placeholder in here. And that's where router view as an element comes in. Router view is basically saying this is the placeholder for whatever component is being shown at this moment. And if we come back to the store and refresh, we'll see it not working. So let's go ahead and open up our console, and it says routers not defined. So somebody typed something wrong. Let's go back to app. And of course, routers here is not what I called the routes. It should be routes right here. Always get confused with these little things. That's where later on us using some other languages like TypeScript or ECMAScript and checkers are going to help us, but we're not quite there yet. Let's come back and refresh. Now that I made the change, we can see for the most part, everything is continuing to work. Now let's create the checkout component. If we go and look at the checkout JavaScript, we'll need to do the same things we did before. So let's call this the checkout component, get rid of the view, get rid of the EL, turn the data into a callback function, and then finally go ahead and create the checkout by calling view.component. And just like we did before, we're going to use a callback to make an asynchronous component by sending in resolve reject and Axios to go ahead and get a templates checkout.html, which we haven't created yet. We'll use a then, again with a callback that takes in the result. We'll set the template based on the result.data and then call resolve with our checkout component that we have added our template to. And then finally do a catch just to call reject in case there is an error condition. Okay, we now have the component looking the way we want it to. Let's go ahead and open up the view for checkout. We're going to move it from a razor view to a view component. So let's take everything except the script tags, of course, and I'm going to leave them here. I'm just going to copy them for now. I'm going to create a new template for checkout.html, and I'm just going to paste that in just completely as is. This page used a couple of different files that we didn't use in the original file. So let's just go ahead and make sure that we have vvalidate over here in the index page. And let's clear this up a little just to make it so that we can see where we're adding things. We'll do frameworks and then our code, just so we're clear where we're getting each of these individual items. Now that we have what should be a completely functional checkout component over in the app, let's go ahead and create another route. We'll say the path in this case is going to be checkout, and the component, unsurprisingly, should be checkout. So the routes, just to be really clear, are looking for a path past the pound sign in our case that is trying to match against what component should be shown. So here we have the two components. Now that we've added the checkout, let's make sure that it's in the index. So we can see checkout is not here yet. So let's just drag it down here after the product list. So we have that file in here as well. We were only using the checkout.js on the checkout page. We're going to need it inside of our app.js, so we now need to include it in checkout. If we come back here and refresh the page, let's see what we did wrong. I screwed up some things in checkout. Let's go take a look at that. Line 20 and line 5, which I think is usually related to line 20, but line 20 probably missing a piece here. Yeah, someone put the semicolon on the wrong line. There we go. So we're returning this entire object, and now it should load our page. Again, the checkout isn't working yet, but we can still come up here and just change the URL and say checkout, and it should take us to that page. And so those changes are inside of our browser history so that we can use the navigations to go forward and back from them. What's happening here isn't a refresh from the server, but simply Vue is changing and swapping out the instance of these. And what's interesting is if we go ahead and buy some items, and then we go to checkout, and we go back again, we'll see the items are still in memory because it's not removing and re-rendering this every time. It's actually just pulling it out of the DOM, showing the other page, but keeping all that data there. Remember, they're all using a shared data store, a Vuex instance, and so we should be able to share all that data across each of these components as we need them. Now let's fix that checkout link. So now let's look at something called router links. If we go and open up that product list.html, the button that isn't working is this button right here. the checkout button. And the reason is we were using Razor in order to specify the path to go to for checkout. And this was perfect for when this was server-side code, but this is no longer server-side code. This is all client-side code or markup that we're going to be using here. So let's get rid of those. And what we'd normally do is have an href here, which we could certainly use. But instead of that, there's a notion inside of Vue Router that allows us to create a component called a router link. The router link has a property called to, where it's saying what client-side link do you want me to go to? And I can put checkout here as the simplest way to handle this. I want this to go to the checkout page within our individual router package. Notice I'm leaving the classes on here because the router link is still just an anchor tag. And so anything I would do to an anchor tag, it will leave alone. In this case, it'll continue to let me leave it looking like a button by using those bootstrap classes. If we go over to Firefox and refresh, we'll see that it now looks like the right page. And if we look down at the bottom left corner, we can see the path that it's going to is what we would expect, checkout. And checkout is taking us to this new part of the application, but at no point is that URL change causing the server to be instantiated. This is all happening within the context of our client. If we do the same for checkout, remember down here there was a button for submitting, but let's go ahead and create a new router link that is going to go to the root of our application. I'm going to add classes for button and button info and just say cancel. This way, if someone gets this page and they want to cancel, it will take them back to the root page. So that should allow us, if we refresh the page to get everything again, to go over to the checkout page and then cancel it by navigating back to the root page. And let's make sure that the state of this is staying constant. Remember, we have 2 vanilla puddings and 2 blood pressure monitors. So we go to checkout. This is where you would fill out your information about you, the customer, but I'm not ready for that yet. So when I go back, guess what? All the context is still there. Let's take this concept a little further and introduce transitions into this changing of whatever is being shown in the router view. Now let's look at routing transitions. If we go back to that root page, the index.cs HTML, we have this router view here. Let's go ahead and add a transition here. And what we're effectively going to do is say that as you change the view that's being shown in the router view, I want you to transition in some way to show the user that we're moving from one to the other. Right now, it's immediately flipping back and forth, and it's a little too fast. So let's give it a transition name of fade. And this will require that we're using CSS Transitions in order to make this change. So we come up to our CSS. Let's go ahead and add it to our site CSS. We're going to add a couple of classes. We're going to say that when we enter or leave the transition, we want to change its opacity, and we want it to take 1/4 of a second. Let me actually start by just making this 1/2 second so it's a little more obvious to see it. And then we're going to have enter and leave to as where the opacity is coming and going to from. So essentially just gives a placeholder for the CSS transition property to actually work against. If we made both of those changes, you may have been able to see a short transition when we refresh the page, but more importantly, when we go to checkout, we'll see that one fades out, the other comes back in, and when we go cancel again, we'll see the fade in and fade out yet again with the new product list. This allows us to use CSS transitions to give the user some essence of what's actually going on. And while this course isn't going to cover CSS transitions at all, I do want to give you the idea of using CSS transitions in order to give that polished look to your application by giving a transition around your router view. It's a pretty common use case without you having to dig in and write a lot of nasty code. Just some CSS and adding the transition element. This is not limited to just fade. What's important here is that the name of the transition here, and again, we could use this on a lot of different things, is the same name that each of these begin with. So you can create a number of these. You might want slide ones, you might want scaling ones, you might want all sorts of things, turning ones, even 3D transitions will work. In our case, we're doing something really simple just so we can explain how it works and let you get through it. We've talked about just landing routes so far. We haven't really looked at parameters. So let's do that next. Let's look at the way we handle parameters to our routes. So now let's look at how to handle parameters to our individual routes. We're going to start by creating a new JavaScript component called product.info.js. We're going to create a pop-up essentially, or a page that the navigation can go to that's going to show information about an individual product. And I'm just going to quickly create a component with some inline template. This is just going to be a very simple page that shows the product name and the product image, as well as a router link back to the home page. The thing we're learning isn't about how we actually put together this component, because it's the same as what we've done every time before. The difference here is that we want to be able to send to this component the product that we want to actually show to the user. And how do we do that? Using router parameters. So let's save that, and then back in our index, let's go ahead and include product info in our page. And then back in our app.js, we're going to need yet another route. And this path is going to be product. And the component will be product info, the component we just created. We'd like to go ahead and point at this path directly in our product page. So let's go ahead and look at that. There's our product list, and there's this button that we really haven't used before, and that was the About button. That button exists on each product on the page. And so let's change this button to a router link. And for the to, we could bind it to product, and it would work. Let's go ahead and just run this. So the About is now pointing at product. We can go to that page, but of course we don't have a product to show, so we can just use this to go back. And this will allow us to go to a product info page, but we can't show it what product we're talking about yet. There's a few ways to go about this, and so let's look and see a couple of different ways. The first way would be to change the path to include something like the ID, or in our case, it's going to be the code for the path, so that this piece of information can be sent down and used as a property in the component itself that's going to get the product list. So let's see what that looks like. Here in the product list, we could then just change this link to include the code we're talking about, which is that GTIN code. But of course, we're going to need to bind it then. So that'll be something like product plus GTIN code. And that ends up being kind of ugly. This ends up not only being ugly, but also fragile. Anytime we're doing this sort of work, it can get kind of nasty. And so one of the things that I propose on router links to use a lot is to actually use binding to a name. So let's come back to app.js. We can actually give it a name. Each of the routes can have their own name, but I'll call this product info route. And then instead of hard coding what the actual path is, this is very similar to the way that we were constructing the links in Razor. We can actually just give it an object syntax where you say name equals product info. And the second thing we can do here is add a params property where we can then pass in one or more parameters. In this case, we'll be able to use that code as just p.gtin code. Now this p.gtin code is the same p that we're getting from the p in products here. So we're really constructing this router link for each and every product separately. We're not using it in our component yet, but if we go back to the browser and go to About, we can see now the product link includes a code that we can use to look it up. So how can we use this? Let's go over to our product info and let's create a new function called mounted, which is one of those lifecycle methods, so that when this template is actually mounted, we're going to call some code. And we can go ahead and get the code by checking in this.route.params, again, the same name as we were using in the object construction.code. So if there was a code being sent down, this will just be a string that represents that code. And then we can go ahead and say this.product equals some way to look up that code. Now we're going to use the store, since that is going to be on our object. Because the root object included the store, it's propagated down to each component that it's being used from. And then we can just dispatch find product as a new action in our store. And I'll go ahead and pass as the parameter our code so we can actually use it. Over in the store again, remember we had mutations and actions. Since we're not actually making any changes, we can go ahead and create our find product that takes the code we're being sent in as well as context, and then just uses Lodash like we've used before to find the object based on the GTIN code. So let's see if this actually works. We refresh the whole page so we're getting all the new code. And now if we go to the About for, let's say, the pudding, now we can see that it didn't work. Let's take a look at why. We'll look at the debugger, and let's go straight to that Vue debugger, just so we can see the state. Let's look at our product info component. We can see that the product is now a promise. That's weird. The reason is that anytime we're calling dispatch, what this is returning is not the result of this, but actually a promise. So in our case, we need to call the dispatch, and that's one of the reasons it's called dispatch, is to know that it's essentially starting a conversation. And then we can just use the then function to get back the result. And remember, we'll need to bind it. Then we can use this dot product equals just the result. If we try it again, we will see now we're getting the vanilla pudding because we're waiting for the result to actually come back. And in this way, we can now look at each and every one of these objects that we want, and we're getting the information about it. Now, this is really ugly and awkward, and that's fine. But for our needs for now, it's functionally doing what we are asking it to. We're asking it to show this other view and then allow us to close it in order to see maybe some details about the individual products. But if we look at the code, this is kind of ugly. There's a couple of reasons. One, we're doing a lot of parsing of parameters and then having to look through data. And this is awkward because inside of our product list, we already have the product. Why can't we just pass as a parameter the actual product and just show that? We can, but there are some drawbacks there. Let's talk about the first drawback, and that is we're containing the information as part of the URL, and sometimes that's exactly what you want. And that's powerful because we're using this information in the URL to figure out what product to place. This idea is that what if you wanted to send this to someone, email a link from your product over to someone else, and they should be able to put this in and have it just work. If this isn't part of the URL and it still just says product, it's not going to know which one to show if you're going to share this. And it may be that that's not an important use case at all, and so having it as part of the URL may not be important. The other problem is this: if we just refresh this page, we're not going to get anything. And the reason for that is the find failed. Why did the find fail? Remember, we're making an assumption here in our data store. We're making the assumption that the catalog has already been filled, and it's filled by calling load catalog, of course, right? This is actually setting the catalog for us, and this is happening on the product list. So the assumption is, because the way we're using find product, is that product info is only being shown after product list is being shown. So we have a few problems here. One, is the URL important enough because you need to share it? Can we just send the object in? And in my mind, the most important problem here is what happens if we just refresh this individual page or send this link to somebody? Should it work? Should it not work? Let's talk about making it a little smarter next. So now let's talk about using routes and component properties instead of just a data element. In the product info component, we're currently using the route parameters to pull that out. I don't really like that because we'd like to be able to supply the code if maybe we wanted to end up using this product info someplace else. So one thing that's supported is to have data as well as properties. And let's create a new property for code. And I'll just say type is a string. We should be able to change this to, instead of getting the code out, just saying this.code, right? Because we're going to assume that the code is going to be the property. But how do we get it in here? We get it in here by telling the route that we're going to use props. What this effectively tells the path is when you get there, if you have one or more parameters here and they match the name of existing properties on the component, just wire that up for us. There are ways to set up props to do binding across them as well, but I'm not going to get into any of that. So with this change, if I refresh my page, go to about, it should still continue to work without that extra wiring. But if we refresh this page or share this link, it still is going to fail. And it's failing because the catalog hasn't been loaded. The trick to fixing that, let's go back over to product info. And if you remember, we're calling find product here and then just getting the result out and setting it as the product. This works. The problem really is in the data store. Our find product makes the assumption that the catalog is going to have been filled by load catalog. And that works in the main case because we're always coming from the product list. Now we could, of course, in our product info, just navigate them back if we don't find it. But I like showing you how this would work as well. First thing we want to do is test to see whether the context.state.catalog.length is equal to 0. So if we have a bad catalog, we're going to need to actually load it. Otherwise, we can just go ahead and return this else. But because we want to load catalog and we know that this is going to be an asynchronous process, we're going to have to return our own promise. Once we take on something asynchronous, we'll make it work entirely. If we're not using anything asynchronous in here, just returning the value, it will wrap it up into a promise structure for you. But once we get into this, we're going to need a resolve, reject, callback function, and then of course instead of return here we're going to say resolve. So if the catalog has been loaded, we can go ahead and just do it as synchronously as we want to. The resolve will call the correct then and we'll get upon our business. To load the catalog, we can then go ahead and do it asynchronously, and we do that by calling context dispatch load catalog. Now we could of course probably call load catalog directly, but I like making sure that all calls into it are going through the dispatch. So we're going to dispatch to our same object. We're going to call then like we would anytime we call then catalog. And if it successfully does it, the catalog should be full. And then what do? We can just resolve with the same call. I could make this prettier so that there's only one exit point, but I'm not going to bother with that for now. And just if there's a problem, we'll go ahead and say catch reject, just in case. Not a lot of cases where we're going to run into that, but it will eventually, so we're going to want that to happen. So let me walk through this just one more time. In the case of coming in where the catalog is already loaded, we're going to wrap this all in a promise, and if the catalog has been loaded, then we're just going to call resolve immediately with that find function. If it's not, we're going to load catalog, and once it has completed loading, we can just resolve and use that same find against our same state. So in this case, we can still just set that product and then just be done with it. So if we've done this right, we go to about, it should continue to work. But if I refresh this or just paste this in a browser and go, it should continue to work because it's loading that catalog first. So now we have it a little more bulletproofed, but I'm still not super happy. The reason is that here in the product list, I already have the product. So I'd love to be able to actually send as a parameter here, just current product, and just send the whole product down instead of having to send the code. Now we might want to create this component to support both cases, and that's what we'll actually do. But this would allow you to send in parameters. Now, why send in the code at all? I like sending in the code because I want the URL to be able to be pasted and just work in every case. In this case, this doesn't get represented in the URL at all because, of course, it's an object. How do you represent it in that way? It just becomes a parameter that we can send in, and that parameter will be then mapped to the properties on our object, right? Because we did the props equals true. So if we come back over here to our properties, let's create another one called current product and say it's not required. Then our mounted, we can actually test for this. If this.current product, if the current product has been defined, let's do something. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and load it from the code. And if it has been defined, we're simply going to say this.product equals current product. Now, why do we need this? Why don't we just bind directly to current product? We could, but properties are not meant to be mutated by the components themselves. Properties are meant to be sent into the component. This is an important idea. And so keeping the product as part of the data means that that is something that we might mutate. And this is just a pathway to send data from the user of our component to us. If we go ahead and change this current product on the next render cycle, it's going to take the data it has as part of that binding, and it's going to rebind it back into the current product. And so we have to have this separation of things we can mutate in data and things that were being sent to us through binding or through simple properties as props. And so components can certainly have data and props because they do two different sort of functions. Both of these cases, we're setting the product based on how we're getting it. And that way it continues to work if we just refresh. And if we do the just click about, we're never having to do the find. The find never needs to happen because we've already actually set the current product by sending the instance of the object. And so this is somewhat a convoluted example, but the idea here is that you're going to want to think about how you're passing properties, both through routing and through other means, and what the difference between data and properties really means. Now let's take a look at the idea of nested routes. Now let's talk about the concept of nested routes. The way we have our application working so far is we have this notion of a product list, and then checkout is going to be some frame that starts a checkout process. You notice we have the next here after they put in the customer information. Let me make that a little smaller so we can sort of talk about this conceptually. You could imagine that the checkout process itself is actually navigating through some steps. This is an idea that as you create more and more complex applications, having navigation within a specific route could make a lot of sense. And in our case, the checkout route might have some sub-routes that deal with the different steps along the way. So if we open up apps, let's go to that checkout route and let's create a new property here called children. And this is going to be an array of individual routes. And so let's go ahead and give it a child route of customer. Component, we'll call this customer. Might want to call them views or whatever you want to say. Shipping, and let's say path confirmation. And the way that children routes work is that this would essentially say that /checkout/customer is going to show this view inside of this view. Huh? How does that work? So let's start, and I think it'll start to make sense. Let's take our checkout view that we have and actually make that into the customer view. In fact, I'm going to open this up. Let's just make a couple of small changes. Checkout is now customer component. Let's make sure we get it everywhere else. We'll call this customer. Almost got them all. And then finally, let's go ahead and change our checkout, because it's really the customer form that's doing it to, right? So we now have our customer component. Let's create a new checkout.js component. And here we'll just create a quick component and just set up as its template a little card that has its own router view. And this is the really important thing about nested routes, is this is going to say what components are going to be shown inside of this component's router view. So it can be router views all the way down, or more importantly, routes all the way down. This is not limited to only having children on top level routes. These routes could have children, these routes could have children, etc. So in this case, the checkout is just going to be a container. In fact, let's go ahead and put something like checkout wizard. So we actually have some piece of the puzzle here that has some UI to it. So checkout wizard is going to just be a header up there, and then we're going to have a card that has each of our views inside of them. So back on our product list, in our checkout, instead of the two just going to checkout, we're going to actually say, go over to checkout customer. It's going to take checkout, and then this sub route will take into effect. Let's see if it'll let us do this before we define all the different routes. Nope. Go ahead and set those up as well. I'm going to create another one for shipping, and this one will be really easy. We're just going to create a shipping component by calling view.component. I'll just call it shipping, and then I'm just going to set up a template to be really simple. I'm just going to create a div. I'll just call that shipping. In this case, I'm going to have the router link that will say next as well. Start to see why it's a good idea to go ahead and use external templates, but we'll get there. Just so that we can go from one page to another. So what are our two here would simply be confirmation. We're going to the next one. Notice that this is just a relative URL, not a complete URL. Let's do the same for customer. Instead of it going and being a submit button, we're going to actually change this to a router link as well. That is going to go to shipping, right? Customer to shipping to confirmation to done. And let's get rid of the fact that it was not a button anymore. And then finally, we'll build the confirmation by just making a copy of shipping real quick to cheat at building our confirmation component. And then we'll just say back to the root, please. Before all this is going to work, we're going to need to go to the index and make sure we have all these new objects defined. So we'll do, there's checkout, so there's customer, shipping, and confirmation. And for a refresh, there we have it. But you see our checkout is now going to the customer. There's our customer. There's our checkout wizard with our little card around it. And when I say next, it should take us to shipping. Shipping take us to confirmation. And notice the checkout wizard isn't changing because this whole router link on the top page isn't being changed. Only the confirmation or the nested router link is being changed. So we can now have, even though none of it is really defined, we can have our entire checkout process. Put in your customer, put in your shipping, and press next to confirm it, and then you're back to the product list. And so nested routes are therefore to handle and be able to do composition of your components at even a lower level. Allows you to define these reusable elements that are only about smaller and different pieces of your application. Now, what we're doing, it sort of makes sense, but you might imagine that some section or some element on your page, some smaller piece, might want that, like, being able to do a search on the page without having to reroute the entire page. Have a search that then navigates to search results or whatever the case may be. And that's one of the benefits of this nested routing, is that you don't have to take over the whole page. You can have these changes of routes happen on a very element by element basis. Let's wrap up this long module. So we've been talking about single applications in Vue primarily through the lens of routing. So Vue routing can help you create spas by allowing you to really compose what the UI looks like, and even page to page what the UI looks like by using routing. I've talked about how using links, both named links as well as pathing links, can help you navigate between these pages. And I've shown you how to pass data to views via parameters and via properties. Finally, I've talked about sub-navigation can be done by using these nested routes to allow you to again compose in these smaller and smaller pieces as necessary. Next, let's take this application as we built it and start to move it into modern techniques using TypeScript, ECMAScript, Webpack, etc.